I'm a big believer in being vulnerable and that being, everybody's superpower, but I think for women it maybe comes a bit more naturally, and not allowing being in a professional setting to mean you have to remove that and don't have to show that and have to play that down. And that's something I learned again later on in a very hard way, that there were people who were trying to encourage me not to be myself and not be vulnerable, again, women. And I kind of went against that and said, no, I'm gonna stick to my guns and be myself.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Blooming Late Scientists. I'm very happy this week because I get to have my friend on here, who you probably know, many of you. And it's Jessica Rietbrock. Did I say that? Rietbrock? Rietbrock, better, yeah. Yes, I apologise, Jess.
That's all right.
But yeah, really happy to have Jess on here. And we're doing something a little different. You might have noticed that we're wearing our football shirts. Well, Jess is wearing her own and I'm wearing my husband's. And that's because this week we're doing
North
versus South, okay, on Women in STEM, Blooming Late Scientists. But yeah, that was just a bit of fun. But Jess, thank you for being here. And
thanks for having
for
me.
the purposes of people listening that may not know you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I did an undergrad and integrated master's in medicinal chemistry. So I'm actually a chemist. That's something not everybody knows about me, I think, given the position that I'm in now. But yeah, I did it. Integrated masters in medicinal chemistry and realised quite quickly that the lab wasn't for me. I did a lot of pipetting in my master's year, which kind of put me off lab life. And then kind of via various different decisions, I guess, fell into recruitment, was in recruitment for a bit. And then after that, I didn't have the best of experiences there. After that, then went into sales, moved down to Cambridge, went into sales, and I've been in the, I guess, immunoassay reagent sales space for the last 8-9 years now. And now I'm an account manager for the north of the UK for protein tech.
And you're quite well known on LinkedIn. Some might say famous.
Make me blush. Famous? Martina, stop. Yeah, I guess a couple of people know me, yeah.
But Jess, can I just ask, before we talk about like the whole women in STEM thing, well, this is part of it, I guess. So why did you decide to go into sales?
Well, do you know what? I had a panic. I had a bit of a panic at the end of my master's because in typical me fashion, I don't really plan what I'm going to do next. I just let life take me down whatever route. And yeah, so I ended up going into recruitment. And then when I realised that wasn't for me, I again had another panic. So I left that job, wasn't very happy, and then was like, what do I do with my life? What skills have I developed in this recruitment role? And I realised, I always say this to people, recruitment is basically just sales, but your product is people in the least weird possible way. So all of the same skills that I'd learned in a very crazy way were very applicable to sales. So I kind of just made that connection and thought, right, what have I learned here? What can I do with it? And sales just seemed obvious. And it seemed like a good opportunity to stay talking to scientists, which I loved in my recruitment job, talking to scientists, being very close to the science, but not doing it myself. So it was just, I guess, a bit of a natural transition from what I had been doing, but it was never part of the plan. Well, I never had a plan, so it could never have been part of the plan. So yeah, like many people, fell into it, basically.
But do you feel like you are close enough to the science?
Yeah, I think most of the time I do. Sometimes, when I'm chatting to people and they're getting really excited about research they've done or they're bringing out a paper, I'm like, oh, maybe that could have been me. Maybe maybe I could have had a real direct impact on the world. But then, yeah, that feeling is there for a bit. And then I realised, actually, I really like my job and it's really tough doing research every day. I don't think I have I'm resilient, but I don't have the kind of resilience I think it takes to go into the lab every day and, have failed experiments and that disappointment, that kind of thing. So I think I'm close enough, yeah. But there are small moments where I think, oh, actually, what if I'd gone back and done a PhD or gone into a research lab or gone into industry or whatever. But they're only a small amount of the days.
Yeah, and I always think there's no point like regretting any of your decisions, is there?
No, absolutely not. And I don't regret it at all. I think I get a good enough mix of talking to scientists and learning about the science without, like I say, having to have had to do it myself. Of course, I talk a lot, I talk a lot about the fact I don't have a PhD, and has that held me back or not? So far, no. Would it have helped? Of course, like I get into discussions and sometimes, well, I'm very honest with customers that, I don't have a PhD in immunology or whatever. I can't get to the same level of depth that maybe some others could. But then the flip side of that is I have other skills that I've developed over the years, in those years, I guess, when I would have been doing a PhD. So yeah, would it have helped? Of course it would, but I don't think it's necessary. And I'm, I guess, living proof of that. You don't need that expertise.
Yeah, you definitely don't. I mean, particularly for someone like you, who's basically like a sales powerhouse. And no, but like the other thing is, Jess, is it's not about the qualification you have. It's about the person you are, right? And you are very proactive. If there was a scenario where you had to learn a part of science, you'd just go and learn it, right?
Yeah.
Not everyone's going to do that. Not even some PhDs do that.
Yeah.
So probably not a lot
true.
to do with your qualifications and more to do with who you are as a person.
Yeah, that is right. And I mean, again, I am proof of that because I'm a chemist, right? I didn't know what an ELISA was. I didn't know what a Western blot was. Genuinely, I had no clue what these things were. And then I was suddenly working for a company that was selling conjugation kits into people doing these applications. And I was like, okay, guess I've got to learn this. And I learned it on the job, and, I had some great training and some really good, I guess, mentors or managers at the time who helped me with that. And then a couple of positions later, I then found myself in a role where I was selling custom antibody discovery programs. And I genuinely, at the time, when I took on that position, had no idea how antibodies were made. I had no idea. And that was during COVID, and I had to teach myself everything. I was learning, making all these diagrams and pinning them up and learning what a hybridoma is and all of these things. So yeah, I guess you're right. And that is a personality thing. I guess some people would have said, I don't know that, so I'm either don't feel capable, even though they probably are, or I just can't be bothered, which I guess is also one way to look at it. If you don't have the time or don't have the dedication to learn about it, then yeah.
Because I mean, without making this a whole show about PhDs, like if you think about a PhD, it's a very small specialism that each person has.
It's true.
So like I still have to learn 10 million things every day about science because I don't know everything.
Yeah, it's true.
So I don't think it puts you in a worse position by any means. Getting back to the topic in hand, women in STEM. So the reason I wanted you on the show, I mean, you already know this, but for people listening, is that Jess and I have talked like in the background, and we did like a conference together, didn't we? And one of the topics that we talked about a lot was about women supporting women in STEM. Because often, when we talk about women in STEM, sometimes there's the idea that it's like an activity to bash men. Sorry, men. It is not. And actually, we wanted to talk about the fact that some of the problem lies in women not supporting women in STEM. But can you talk a little bit about your experience as a woman in STEM?
Yeah. I guess where to start, I think some of the more classical issues that I guess women face, and I think some of the things you've alluded to there, this idea that it's not being perceived as worthy or not being perceived as the same level as a man with the same level of experience. I know there's a lot of people have faced those kinds of challenges, not just in STEM, but in, lots of different positions. They're not I'm lucky that they're not necessarily the things that I've experienced over the years. So I don't feel that I've ever, especially in a position where there's been, a man who's been my manager or part of a hiring process, I've never felt, and maybe I haven't noticed it or recognized it, but I've never felt that I was kind of discriminated against on the basis of being a woman. So I guess I feel lucky in that respect. But then there have been certain instances, I think, especially being in a commercial position, being very customer facing, where I have faced, especially because I'm quite active on LinkedIn, faced, I guess, some interesting situations where I've had to navigate staying professional, encountering some, having weird messages or having to, understand how to respond to somebody where you're not being, you're not making assumptions based on what you've heard, or I guess finding that boundary between being a woman, being a professional, but also kind of, putting your foot down or calling out bad behavior. That's one thing I think I have experienced, which has been a bit challenging. And that's generally more of a issue for women, especially in kind of, like I say, probably more in commercial roles because we're more customer facing. And then also, like you said, I would probably say I've had more issues with women in the workplace and female leaders than I have with men, which has been interesting and very hard. I think almost harder, not that it should be any different, but almost harder to take, because you expect a level of camaraderie, you expect a level of understanding, mutual understanding. We're all women, and of course there's so many, we're all very different, but I guess I just expected more of a sisterhood, if you want to say that. And so my experience with women in the workplace has probably arguably been at least more obviously detrimental than with men. So I'm a bit of a mixed bag, but I think I've not necessarily faced some of the same challenges that other women have, maybe the more obvious things, and I'm lucky for that. Either that or I'm just completely oblivious to them and I'm just telling myself they're not there.
I mean, never be apologetic for not feeling like you've had those experiences. Like, don't feel apologetic.
It's a hard one. Yeah, it's a hard one, isn't it? Because you almost feel bad and guilty that other women or other people have had to go through a certain thing and you haven't. And it's not to say that, it's not, I guess it's not meant as a brag, like, oh, I haven't had to face these challenges. But yeah, there we are. That's another trait, I guess, being apologetic and apologizing for things I don't really need to apologize for.
But it is really interesting that you say this. And I mean, I don't want you to be apologetic, because this is why I have you on here, because you've got a different perspective. And I didn't want this to be a podcast that was all like one angle all of the time. Like, I wanted men involved in the conversation. I want to talk about women supporting women. Like, it has to be, if we don't talk like this, then we do isolate other groups. So it's really important. But
True.
The whole women supporting women thing is really funny, because I've also experienced it. And I also have to be very aware myself. And we talked about this previously, about this whole masculine and feminine energy. And lots of women have developed or have learnt to use masculine energies to the extreme, which I know I've done myself in the past, for sure. But I
have done too. Sorry.
No, I was going to literally hand over to you and say, like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I've had this problem, not a problem necessarily, but I guess and football's a really good example, right? Because football classically has been a very male-dominated sport, and that's changing, which is a great thing. But to be interested in football and be a woman is a bit, or at least was in the past, a bit more unique, right? And I've worked in bars and I've worked in these kinds of very male-dominated areas where, being one of the few women, you've got to kind of adapt a bit, or you feel like you have to adapt a bit to fit in, right? So when the football's on, all the lads are behind the bar going like this, you kind of feel like you have to change a little bit to be able to be part of it. And I think that's always come quite naturally to me, because I do genuinely love football. So I think that's made it a bit easier for me. And even now to this day, I'll talk to customers about football, I'll talk to other people, and it makes it quite a lot easier to have conversations with people where you might not necessarily know what you have in common in networking and that kind of thing. But then I noticed that actually became one of my, almost like Achilles heel when I went into that recruitment job, because it was very male dominated. I think it still is. I mean, like I say, I left that behind and was like, heck no, that's not for me. But it was very male dominated. When I joined, I think I was the second female employee into the company, and it was very boisterous, a lot of younger lads having a good time and bantering. And because I'm the kind of person who takes a joke, I'm very thick-skinned, I always have been. Not that it takes a lot to really bother me. And I almost, why I say it was an Achilles heel is because I almost felt like with hindsight, I allowed a lot of the behaviours to happen by, getting involved with the banter, showing from the get-go that I could take a joke. And it almost became like I was the weakling because of that. And I didn't notice it. And it took a lot of time for me to realise that I became the person that people could pick on because they thought it was okay. And it was under the guise of banter. And that was, for me, that was actually, now I'm just going to go back on everything I've said. That was a good example of where it was the male-dominated environment that led to that. Do I believe that a group of women would have behaved that way? Probably not. It was a lot of name calling. It was a lot of insults. It was a lot of, really personal things. However, I must say that at that time, there were women in the office who not only didn't stick up for me, they actually actively joined in. And that's, I think, what made it even more painful. But yeah, there it became like, to the original point, this idea of changing yourself a little bit for the environment that you're in, and in that case, an environment full of men, but then almost it became my downfall almost, because then they almost thought that they could get away and they could push and push and push. And perhaps at the start, had I been a bit more, I guess, nipped it in the bud a bit earlier, then maybe I wouldn't have had a year full of that. But I think it does happen. I think we naturally downplay certain personality traits like emotions or vulnerability. And that's one thing that you'll know this, I'm a big believer in being vulnerable, and that being, everybody's superpower, but I think for women it maybe comes a bit more naturally, and not allowing being in a professional setting to, mean you have to remove that and don't have to show that and have to play that down. And that's something I learned again later on in a very hard way, that there were people who were trying to encourage me not to be myself and not be vulnerable, again, women. And I kind of went against that and said, no, I'm gonna stick to my guns and be myself. So yeah, a lot to say on the topic.
No, thank you so much, Jess. I'm sorry that you had to go through that anyway. It's horrible. It kind of reminds me, I don't know if you ever heard about the Zimbardo experiment in psychology.
No.
So
no.
I'm not that clever, by the way. I just randomly learnt this on YouTube. But basically, there was an experiment where it was like a week long or something ridiculously short, or it was meant to be longer. And they split these participants into two groups. And one set would play prisoners, like in a prison,
Mm-hmm.
and the other set would play like the prison officers.
Okay.
And what they did was they gave them all uniforms so it was very realistic. They put them in an environment, they gave them the uniforms, and they had to stop the experiment after 2 days because it was so severe. The prison officers were treating the prisoners so poorly, inhumanely, and the prisoners had adapted the feeling of like the behaviours of being vulnerable and being a prisoner.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was like it's like a very well-known study apparently in psychology.
Okay.
But what you described in terms of like your recruitment environment just reminded me of that particular study, where people just adapt. And this is the other issue, isn't it? We're taught to adapt to each situation we become part of. But how much of that is adaptation, and what's the line? Like, how much of that is us trying to squeeze into someone else's box?
Yeah, I think the hard thing, if I was to look back, I would say this was my first graduate job. I was very early in my career. I was almost 10 years younger now. And I've always been quite a secure person. I've always been quite, well, not always actually, that's not true. Since my, I guess, early adulthood, I've been very secure and a very confident person. But I think it's you may be a bit more vulnerable to behave in a certain way because you think you have to fit in. You're under the pressure. It's your first job. You need it to be, a success. At the time, I was very conscious of not having under a year on my CV at a certain place. So I was very, I've got to get to 12 months. I've just got to get to 12 months no matter what happens. And I think that put that extra pressure on me to behave in a certain way or to accept certain behaviors. Whereas now, if I went into a job, I mean, first of all, I would probe company culture a lot more before I went into that kind of environment. Company culture and the person that you work for directly as your boss, super important. Now I would do a lot more probing before I went into a company. So I would try and get a better feeling for what it's going to be like when I'm there to begin with, to avoid that. But if I did end up in that environment, I think I'd cut my losses a lot more quickly, and I wouldn't allow myself to go down that road for so long. So I think it's also an age and experience thing, sadly. And, you know, it's not to say we should go through those experiences. Of course, it was a learning curve. Of course, I learned a lot. Would I recommend going through that? No, of course not. It was absolutely brutal. But I do think it's an element of age. And I think as I've got older, I've become more sure of myself and my own value to a company as well. I've become a lot more, I always describe it as being stubborn. I'm just stubborn. I will not allow people now to mold me to how they want me to be, you know, to a degree, of course you do for a job, but I'm myself, and that's my number one priority now. And I think that's, it's come with age and experience, which is one positive that's come out of it all, I guess.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Most people can't believe that when I was younger, I was actually really quiet and I had no confidence, but I really was. Like, I had none for so many years. And actually, it wasn't until I went to uni at 30 that I started to build confidence, because suddenly I thought, oh, I can actually do stuff. Yeah. So it is an age and experience thing, I think. But going back to the like women supporting women thing, because it's my fault, we got totally sidetracked. So
that's us.
Do you, from your own experience, what do you think about this idea of like masculine and feminine energy playing a part in this?
Yeah, I think it does play a part. And I think over the years, because of some of the things I've experienced, especially with women, I've almost become a little bit cynical that in order to become a brilliant leader in STEM or in any industry as a woman, you kind of have to let go of some of the fantastic traits that we generally have as women. So some of the empathy, some of the kindness, some of the, I guess, warmness that a lot of women have. And I guess that's been almost based on some of the experiences I've had and some of the female leaders I've seen. And that has made me, like I say, a bit cynical and a bit sad to think that that's something you have to do. But then conversely, I've also had some brilliant male leaders around me who have shown that they exhibit those wonderful characteristics themselves, and that, you know, you can be a strong male leader and also be, you know, extremely warm and very empathetic and all of these kinds of things. So, yeah, and I actually had a friend of mine who did say that he suspected that he had a similar feeling of women in leadership, that they almost have to. And part of that is almost this idea that you have to elbow people out the way to get to where you are, and that the whole process of being a successful woman is already so much more challenging that, you know, you have to be a bit more feisty and a bit more fiery. And yeah, it has made me a bit cynical over the years, and I think it probably has also impacted my feelings towards becoming a leader and my concern that I would worry to be successful and to have a team and to become whatever. Again, I don't have goals, so I'm a terrible example of that, but I guess it's made me worry that I have to give up the things that I really like about myself in order to get to that position. And that's a tough position to be in. However, especially recently over the last year or two, as I've done more on LinkedIn and as I've met more amazing, really inspirational women, it has started to undo that a little bit. So I have met a lot of great founders or CEOs or whatever that are women and are clearly really still have a lot of those female attributes that I really admire. So yeah, it's a bit of a balance at the moment. It's going the other way, but it is a bit of a shame that the early experiences I've had have kind of shaped, you know, in a way that's also shaping my vision for my future. Is that something I really want to do? Do I have what it takes almost? Do I have this ability to elbow people out the way and get to where I want to be? And the answer, if I have to do that, is no. But do I have to do that? that's what's, I guess, the number one question still for me.
It's interesting that you brought up the vulnerability thing, because I always find this so fascinating. Like, I mean, we could go on about this forever, but like, we see so many leaders that talk about vulnerability. They talk about the subject of vulnerability. So leaders, you're not going to like what I'm about to say. But actually, from my own experience in many companies, there's lots of leaders that talk about how important vulnerability is, and there are very few that are vulnerable. And it's such a conflict, because, you know, talking about how important it is to be vulnerable so people can relate to you and you can lead them well, and, you know, you build this trust, and then at the same time not being vulnerable. Like, have you noticed that yourself?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think and it's hard to tell whether it's, again, this is maybe a bit cynical maybe, but it's hard to tell if maybe that's fake and inauthentic, and people are saying, oh, you know, we need to be vulnerable, but then it doesn't really play out because they say it and it's smoke and mirrors. And again, I think this is part of the being in the corporate world and, you know, working for especially companies that are public. There are certain tick box exercises that I feel go on in order to be able to say to an investor, this, and this, and this. And it's similar with this concept of vulnerability. I think people talk the talk, but when it comes to walking the walk, they're not either comfortable to do it, or, you know, you could argue that some women, and probably myself also, you could argue that, well, if I show I'm vulnerable, am I then vulnerable to, I don't want to attack, sounds weird, but is that going to make me then seen as weak? Am I then not a strong leader? Am I then not able to command a room? Am I then not able to exhibit the other attributes I need to be successful? So it's, whether it's a deliberate act of inauthenticity, if that's a word, or if it's just a genuine conflict of that's what you want to do, but you're worried that that will then stunt your ability to grow and develop. I don't know, but I do think it's a problem. And I think until it's clear that it's not going to hold you back, I don't know if we'll ever get to a position. Again, I'm being very cynical. Sorry, you didn't bring me on here to be cynical.
I totally did.
But yeah, I don't know if we'll ever get to a position where where we feel like we can be completely vulnerable and that won't hold us back, and we won't then be seen as, you know, the woman that cries or, you know, whatever. I don't know if we'll ever get there. Hopefully we'll get there and we'll get closer. And like I say, I think for me personally, seeing more and more, you know, women talk very openly, like, you know, the women that you're having on this podcast, right? Mm. Women who are able to say, these are the things I've struggled with, and not feel that they're going to be judged, or, you know, for example, for me as a customer, going to think, oh, that Jess, she's a bit of a sap. She can't deal with the corporate world, you know, woe is me. I mean, I don't care about those things, obviously, but yeah, hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah.
One day.
I think we will. It's going to be a slow process, because, I mean, you know, I agree with what you've just said about, like, it's difficult to know, is it inauthenticity? That is the word, isn't it? Or is it just that also people don't recognise really what vulnerability is? I can't talk. But like, leading on from that, and just for 1 second, I want to take female founders out of this equation.
Yeah.
Because I'm talking about a different thing here, but if we look in companies that are founded and, you know, predominantly led by men, and then and I'm talking particularly in STEM subjects, but there are obviously women in leadership, not as many, but it's interesting that you talk about your own experiences of women leaders and this kind of masculine behaviour. And I often ask myself, like, is that what we need to do to get into leadership, women? Is that the only way we get there?
Yeah, that's exactly the question I've had as well. What has, and I think that's why these conversations are important, right? So we need those leaders to be telling us what they did. Did they have to sacrifice something? And I mean, we haven't got onto it, but there's obviously the family aspect as well as being a woman. That holds a lot of women back, and that's something, I consider all the time. What have they done to get to where they are? Have they made certain sacrifices? Do they feel that they've had to downregulate certain, very scientific term, downregulate certain parts of themselves in order to get to that? Is that something they're aware of? I don't know if there's studies have been done to show how people are maybe different, but I think it probably takes a lot more analysing the people who are already in those positions and seeing what it is about them that's got them to that. Is it because, they did have these attributes and downplay their more feminine energy? Or was it just because they're brilliant and they had, I think a lot of it as well comes down to allyship and having men who advocate for the women that are in their company. That's one thing that I've had a lot of, which is why I actually feel that in a lot of cases I've had more positive experiences with male leaders, is that I've had some really brilliant bosses and colleagues who have really helped to mentor me, given me opportunities, seen the potential in me, and really tried, right? Which is, I'm not in a leadership position, but that's what's got me to the position I'm in, because people have backed me. And I think we need more of that. And that, whether that's from females or males, we just need more of that in general. And I think so it's a combination, I guess, of understanding what has got those people to those positions, and also increasing the amount of support there is and allyship there is and opportunities, and actively, and also trying to eradicate the issues of imposter syndrome that especially is a problem with women. In the past I went for a position for an internal move, and I would never have applied for this position on my own. I just would never have. I saw the job description, I saw the colleagues around me, their age, their experience. I said, right, I'm too much of a spring chicken for this position. And it was actually my colleagues who said, hey, you can do this. We've seen what you can do. You've been with the company for X amount of time. You're very capable of doing this. Go and apply. And if I hadn't been for them, it was a mixed group, I probably wouldn't have applied. And actually one of the biggest feedbacks I got from that, I did get the position fair and square, was that I didn't back myself enough. Ironically enough, I didn't sell myself enough, despite being a salesperson. And that, I think, is part of who I am as a person, because I do think I'm quite humble, but also I think because I'm a woman, right? And that's a clear trait in women, that we, don't oversell ourselves, in fact undersell ourselves most of the time. And that's a feedback that I got, and luckily the people who were interviewing me and the other aspects of the interview were great, but they knew me and what I can deliver. So again, having the right people in the room and having those people behind you is so important. So I think there's an element of that as well in pushing women into leadership, having the right people backing them and supporting them.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things you said there, which actually by the time this episode airs, people will have seen the first episode, which is Rachel Pierce.
Cool.
And interestingly, a discussion came up there about women downplaying their achievements. They tend to do that much more than men.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that all men are really confident about their achievements, but women in particular really have an issue with talking about what they're good at. Even from my own experience, I remember, and they might be listening to this and they'll remember this themselves, but I applied to a marketing agency to be a science writer. And I just thought, I had no confidence. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. And they took me on. And about 3 months after I started there, I had a call with them, and they basically promoted me. I hadn't asked, and I remember at the time the guy who owned the business said, why didn't you say you could do any of this in your interview? And I was like, well, because I thought if I said it and then I couldn't do it, I'd look like an idiot, so I just didn't say anything. And he was like, oh my God, you've done so much. And and that's why, like you say, it's so important, when you're in these spaces, that not only do we learn to advocate for ourselves, but also that there are people that recognize these things and know how to maybe ask the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And then again, it comes back to, it doesn't even just need to be women raising women up. It's just anybody raising women and anybody raising anybody ultimately. But that's why I do a lot of the things I do on LinkedIn. And we've discussed this before offline, this idea of helping other people. And, when somebody reaches out to you, giving them advice. I've had loads of people ask me, I'm interested in getting into sales. What's it like? Have you got any tips and tricks? I've had, loads of people who have been hiring for somebody, and I've known somebody and I've said, get in touch with this person. And, when it comes to a recommendation from somebody you trust, it has a bit more weight. And if everybody just did a bit more of that, I think would be in a better situation. If everybody just helped other people out a little bit more, would be, because that helps, even if you're not moving internally, if you're going to a company where you don't know anyone, if somebody else knows somebody in that company and says to them, hey, they're actually brilliant, I highly recommend them. Okay, you don't have someone in that boardroom or whatever when you walk in, but you've already got that small, I guess, extra token against you. And that's something that would help, especially for us if we're not selling ourselves well enough. If somebody else has done the job for you a little bit, that helps. But yeah, if everyone just did a bit more of that, I think would be in a better state. And that's not me bigging myself up.
No,
it is me bigging myself up.
You should sell yourself. Sell yourself, Jess. But you know what? It's so true. Like I think of my own experiences, and like when I was younger, I was so toxic. I was so dysfunctional. Like I'm just being honest.
Oh, really?
Oh God, totally. I still have quite a lot of masculine energy. People will say that, but I had like a toxic amount of masculine energy. Oh, really? Totally, yeah. And actually being in a PhD environment made that so much worse. But now, I've been in different environments and, I've just got older, and actually things have happened to me in life that have softened me. Things just happen. And now I'm such a big believer that one of the things I really see a lack of is we don't, when people do something well, we don't tell them.
Yeah.
Like nobody tells one another and just says like, do you know what? You did that presentation. You did such a good job. Like the way you communicated that, it was brilliant. And now I'm such a big advocate for that. Like in the company I work in and, in my own family, when someone does something good, tell them.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's a huge thing, isn't it? It's so weird. I guess companies could get better at having better, I love the phrase feedback loop. I've used it about 15 times this week, but having that, like having regular, if you're in a one-to-one, talking about what somebody's done well as what they can improve on, and making that a regular part of a process, whether that's in one-to-ones or, we have performance evaluations maybe once a year or whatever. It's nice once a year to hear you did something, great. But then 2 weeks later, you've already forgotten it. But if you had those small, regular kind of tidbits of you did this really well, blah, 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 that would, yeah, it's a nice thing. And again, that's something we should just get better at. I don't know why people don't. Maybe it feels awkward. Like for me, I would love to be one of these people. I have to say, I would love to be one of these people that just walks up to someone and says, I love what you're wearing. Someone did that to me at a work event we had in January. This lovely lady just walked past me and she went, that blouse looks amazing on you. And I just got it for Christmas off my mum. And I was like, that's so nice. Thank you so much. And now every time I put it on, I think of her and what a lovely compliment she gave me. And I think, why don't I do that? Why don't I? Because I think lovely things about people all the time. But I guess it's that, I don't know if it's like an awkwardness and being perceived as like, what's this weirdo coming up to me? I don't think of it that way. So I don't know why I think other people would. But it's that, I guess it's so uncomfortable. You think in your head, people are going to think you're a weirdo for talking to them. Maybe I was in Cambridge for too long. Because up here, I think people would, in Liverpool, for people who don't know, people would be absolutely happy to hear that. And I was so chuffed. I was like smiling all day. I thought, I didn't know I looked so good in this. And maybe if we just got a bit better at doing those things, it doesn't have to be about the way you look or something you're wearing. But that was a nice example for me. And businesses could do better at that. You could have better, feedback, more frequent feedback, and trying to think outside of the box. And we've discussed, and I talk quite a lot about being a salesperson. You're kind of just defined by did you hit target or not, and then you're so much more than that. But you can do all of these extra things, but a lot of companies won't necessarily recognize that, and it's not necessarily a malicious thing. But if you hit target, you're doing a fantastic job. But if you didn't, you know, you're not very good. But actually there's so much more. And I think if we did more to, and that can be applied to lots of other types of jobs with any form of KPI, right? But I think if we did more to acknowledge the smaller things that people have done, like, oh, thanks for setting that call up, or thanks for helping, you know, with the hiring process of that person, or I don't know, those smaller things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We won't say too much about that because obviously we're going to talk about that.
Oh yes, yeah, we are going to talk about that.
We might have already talked about it by the time this comes out. I'm not sure, but yeah, we're going to be talking sales and marketing on a different platform.
Spoiler alert.
But no, you're right. This, you know, feedback loop. Sorry, I'm going to throw it out there again. But and the whole thing about like women not being able to sell themselves. Like if we heard praise. And like, it's not like spoon feeding people. It's not like you have to tell me every 10 seconds how great I am. But when someone does a good job and, you know, women notoriously are bad for selling themselves, I feel like that would help. Because if someone says to me, oh, do you know what? You're really good at that. Like half the time I'm like, am I? But then you think, oh, okay, well, maybe I am. And it feeds into that like confidence thing, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a I don't know the psychology of it, but it's like that evidence-based, like how you see yourself and how you feel about yourself, you draw on the evidence around you. And if you never have evidence that you're good at something, then I guess you're not going to assume, especially as a woman. But then if you're having that reinforced in different, like just yesterday, somebody came up to me and said, oh, I really like what you do on LinkedIn. And I mean, that's not something that I don't think I'm good at, but it's nice to have those small reminders of things. And yeah, like you say, it doesn't need to be all the time. Like then we'll just end up with massive egos. But reinforcing certain ideas is nice.
Yeah,
and helps remind people what they're good at, especially other than just their core competencies that they're expected to be good at to keep their job.
Yeah. So trying to wrap this up, because I know you and I can talk for hours.
Yeah, it's a dangerous one.
But when it's a podcast, people don't listen for that long. But in your opinion, what do we need to do to be more supportive to women in science? And I say this not just from men, I'm talking other women. Like, what do we need to do?
Well, I think, this is obviously a good forum, right? Because you're just having those conversations. And I think the more that women who are perceived to be successful, be that because of leadership or because of a certain position or, because they have a billion publications or whatever it is, right? Certain job title, yada, yada, yada. I think if those women who are put almost on a pedestal sometimes come into forums like this and say, actually, I struggled with this, and this, and I'm not the most confident, and I have, imposter syndrome. I think the more that people, it's kind of normalized that these are things that we all struggle with. There are very few women or otherwise people out there who don't have things they struggle with. So I think the first thing is just making it more open that people do have these problems, even people that you perceive to be highly successful. And she couldn't possibly have imposter syndrome. Look how confident she is. Well, we do all struggle with that. That's the first thing, I think. Then more forums for people to get together and talk. So like Rachel with the STEM, I don't know what she calls
it. Women in Life Science.
Oxford Women in Life Science. There you go. That's a good example. Then Saba in the Northwest where I am, Northwest Women in STEM. I think these communities of people who are geographically close, because that helps, being able to get together and talk and network with each other and learn from each other and be those people who, I've met loads of people now in the Northwest through that. And when they have questions about what I do, or they need support, or they need advice on things that I've done, and vice versa, of course, we're there. So we've created that community. So, talking about it, making it more normal, having the communities where women can come together, but then also, to your point about men, bringing men into the discussions and not just having these insular communities where only women talk to women. That's great, but we also need the men to be involved in these discussions and understand and hopefully listen to these kinds of discussions to understand what they can do better to support women in their organizations or their colleagues. Be that just as simple as like we just said, saying to a female colleague, that was really brilliant. I loved how you did that presentation, especially if it's, maybe related to more masculine energy type traits, being like, you really commanded that room, this idea of, whatever. So yeah, I think it's just having more conversations, and that has to be both women with each other to feel normal and like they're not the only ones struggling with something, but also men getting involved in those discussions and having, and giving their perspective on it, right? And giving, and being part of it, and possibly taking away some learnings from that, especially leaders, being able to understand what women are facing and how to make those changes. And I think, I've seen a shift even since I've been in my career, like I said, about culture and about leadership. These are things that I didn't necessarily think about at the start. But now one of my favorite things, and I'll have said this to you many a time, one of the favorite things about the company I work for is my boss, a man, and the leadership that we have here. It's a very open culture. They really appreciate everything that we do. There's a lot of, feedback. Thank you so much for doing that. That was great. And it's a really nice environment. And I think you'd be mad as a current leader or a future leader to not consider these topics that we're discussing. They're the things that will attract, especially as the younger generations come through, the younger generations of women. That's what they'll focus on much more than salary, or, the science can be brilliant, but if you hate your job and you hate your life every day and you can't get that work-life balance, it doesn't matter about the science at that point. So, yeah.
I love that, Jess.
That's my...
And I'm not a young woman anymore.
Yes, you are.
Well, no, but the thing that you said there that really resonated with me was that younger women are going to come in and, this sounds like I'm some kind of like Florence Nightingale, but I'm not. But, I've got a daughter. She's 24. Mm-hmm. She's a physicist. You know this.
Mm-hmm. I do.
And for me, like, I feel that I've got a part to play to ensure that those generations don't come through and have to face this same nonsense.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like, I don't want that to happen. I want it to be different.
Yeah.
And generations before us fought for that, women. You know?
Exactly.
So it takes work, and men have to be included, because we can't make change without everybody involved.
Yeah.
Like, it's impossible.
Exactly. Yeah, it's almost like a responsibility that we have. I guess that's what you were describing there. A responsibility that we have to make sure, people don't have to go through the same things. Okay, there's only 10 or 15 or 20 years between us and the next generation. I don't understand how it all works. Bottom end of millennial. Top end
I'm top
millennial?
end. No, hold on.
Bottom and top end.
I don't know, but we're either end.
Which way around? Opposite
I'm the
ends.
early end.
You're the early end, right? But it is almost a responsibility. And why do people have to? And that's why I think both of us do a lot of the content we do on LinkedIn, right? We're helping people not make the mistakes that we've made. And that's not necessarily related to being a woman, but I battled for years and years and years on LinkedIn, and no one ever cared, and everything I did was absolutely useless. And now, over the last few years, I've realized what works. So now I try and feed that back and help other people not do the same mistakes. And it's a similar thing, I think. Why do people have to struggle with the same things we've struggled with? Why can't we just make it better? And I'm sure other things will crop up, and it's not necessarily a Florence Nightingale thing. I think it's just, I guess it's a responsibility we have, and especially with platforms like we have, being able to get the message out there a bit more and make people feel a bit more like what they're struggling with is normal.
We need people who aren't afraid to very, very gently rock the boat. Not tip it over, but just rock it slightly and go, right, come on. But you know what, Jess? I love talking to you all the time, but I just knew you'd have so much valuable stuff to say, and I'm so happy that you came on here, because I think you've said so much valuable stuff.
Good, I'm glad.
But now everyone's going to want to connect with you. So how do they do that?
How do they do it? They just find me on LinkedIn. There's only one me, and I say that only because I've got a funky surname. So you'll not struggle to find me. But I'm always happy to talk to people via LinkedIn. connect with me, send me a message. I might take a while to reply because I do get a lot of messages. But yes, and I've in theory also got a job to do. But yeah, I'm very happy to talk to people, especially on this topic, but on anything really. I'll talk to anyone.
Yeah,
literally anyone.
I will put a link to Jess's LinkedIn actually on the post when it goes out, so people can find
very
you.
Good.
But yes, thank you so much, and
thanks for having me.
I'm excited to do a sales and marketing live with you at some point.
Oh yeah,
but, yeah, another topic.
Be fun.
Thanks, Jess.
No worries.
And to everyone else on Blooming Late Scientists, we'll see you next week for another episode. Bye bye.